On the top floor of Ironbridge Holdings, dozens of executives lifted their glasses to toast Elena Marsh's promotion to chief executive. Then she walked across the room and tipped a full glass of champagne over Nathan Voss's head. The room erupted with laughter. Some pointed, others raised their phones to film the wine soaking through his suit. Elena smiled, certain that the last rival standing between her and complete control had finally been put in his place. Nathan wiped his face, looked at her, and asked evenly, "Are you sure you want everyone to remember tonight like this?" Why was he so calm? Ironbridge Holdings occupied 40 floors of glass in the heart of the downtown business district, and on paper it was worth just under $20 billion spread across investment, technology, and logistics, with dozens of subsidiaries scattered across the country, some older than the tower itself. People who worked there liked to say the company had never truly been run by the person whose name hung on the executive suite door. For most employees that was pure cynicism. For a few, it was something closer to an observation. Elena Marsh had spent 11 years working her way to that door. She started in corporate development, moved into operations, then spent 4 years fixing a distribution division that 2 men before her had failed to save. She was good, everyone agreed on that. What people said more quietly was that she kept score, and that her ledger had no column for forgiveness. When the board voted, it wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Elena Marsh would be the next chief executive of Ironbridge Holdings. She heard the news in a conference room on the 38th floor, thanked the directors with exactly the right amount of humility, and walked into the hallway, where she allowed herself one long breath. This was the biggest thing she had ever won. Nathan Voss had been in the room when the vote was announced. He was vice president of strategy, and had held the title long enough that people had stopped asking how he'd gotten it. What they knew about him was almost entirely professional. He fixed things. When a subsidiary was bleeding money, when a deal was falling apart at the closing table, when a partner threatened to walk away, Nathan was the one who flew out and came back 3 days later with a signed agreement. What they didn't know about him was everything else. He never talked about where he came from. He never posted photos. He barely drank at company events, and he never mentioned family. Colleagues who'd worked beside him for 6 or 7 years couldn't have told you the name of the town he grew up in. It wasn't rudeness, it was a door that had been quietly shut long ago and never reopened. Eventually people stopped knocking. His surname registered with a few people early on, then stopped registering. Voss was common enough that 2 other employees shared it in the legal department alone. Edmund Voss hadn't held an operating role in 12 years, he sat as non-executive chairman and came to headquarters maybe 3 times a year for board sessions most of leadership never saw. Anyone who briefly wondered about a connection answered themselves with the obvious logic. A man related to the chairman wouldn't have spent 6 years flying out to failing subsidiaries in the interior of the country. 2 board members treated Nathan with a deference nobody could quite explain. Grace Ellery, who'd sat on that board for 19 years and had a reputation for treating executives like passing weather she'd already outlasted, listened when he spoke and said so out loud. That kind of thing got noticed. In a building where access was currency, Nathan had access nobody could trace to a source. That was what Elena couldn't stand. Before the vote, she'd believed Nathan was the only person in the company capable of taking the chair from her. His proposals came back from the board with fewer red marks. When one of her cost-cutting initiatives caused a problem 3 levels down, managers didn't escalate it to her, they walked into his office and closed the door. She learned about half her own operational failures secondhand, through him, phrased in a way that never once sounded like an accusation, which somehow made it worse. Elena never read any of that as competence. She read it as a threat. Competence was something she could measure and outwork. A man that people went to instead of her was something else entirely. She'd spent 2 years watching him with the specific attention of someone building a case she hadn't yet decided to file. Then the board voted, and it was over. The chair was hers. Whatever contest she'd been running in her head against Nathan Voss, she'd won it, and she wanted him to know it. The celebration was held that same evening on the top floor, in the long room with the wall of windows overlooking the river to the north. It was supposed to be a private gathering for leadership. Catering lined one wall, a bar sat at the far end, and the view made everything look like it had already been decided in their favor. By 9 o'clock it had stopped being a corporate function. The music got louder. The bartenders stopped asking what people wanted and just kept pouring. Somewhere in the second hour, the gathering finished its transformation into something older and simpler. A group of people who'd all just discovered they were standing on the winning side, and wanted to enjoy that feeling in front of one another. Nathan stayed near the windows for most of it. He had one glass and never finished it. Grace Ellery found him there around 10 and they talked about the fourth quarter for a while, which, she noted dryly, was the only conversation in the room actually about the company. She was 61. She'd outlasted 4 chief executives, and she'd already decided she didn't like the sound the room was making. The game started near the bar. One of the vice presidents suggested truth or dare, and it should have died right there, the way bad ideas usually die among adults with equity packages. Instead it caught fire, because Elena laughed at it, and because everyone in the room had spent the last 6 hours learning to laugh at whatever Elena laughed at. Derek Sloan lost the round. He was head of corporate operations, 44, with the specific looseness of a man who'd backed the right candidate and knew it. He threw up his hands and asked for the dare, and the group turned to Elena, because by then the group turned to Elena for everything. She took her time with it. Then she said Derek should choose someone in the room and pour his champagne over their head. The laughter came fast. The loud, unstable kind people make when they're relieved a dare has landed on someone else. Derek scanned the room, playing it up, and the room played along, until Elena's eyes drifted to the windows and stayed there. Derek followed her gaze and understood immediately. His expression shifted, just slightly. Nathan Voss wasn't a junior analyst. He was a senior executive of the company. He stood quietly with a glass he'd barely touched. And whatever the room found funny, there would be a version of this story told the next morning. Derek hesitated. Elena laughed at him for it. "If you don't have the nerve," she said, "I'll do it myself." She took the glass out of his hand. She crossed the room, and people moved out of her way, because at that hour, in that mood, they'd have moved out of the way of anything. Nathan watched her come. He didn't step back, and he didn't set his own glass down. Which somehow made the moment worse for everyone watching, because it removed the possibility that he hadn't seen it coming. She raised her arm and poured the entire glass over his head. For 1 second the room went completely silent. The music kept playing. Champagne ran through Nathan's hair, down the side of his face, into his collar, and across the shoulder of a suit pressed that same morning. He blinked once against the sting of it. Then the laughter broke, enormous. Someone near the bar actually applauded. Phones came up, 4 or 5 of them, held at chest height, the way people hold a phone when they want to record something without looking like they're recording it. Derek laughed hardest of anyone, because relief and cowardice sound almost exactly like delight. Elena turned to the room with her arms slightly open, the way a performer accepts applause. "It's a game," she said. "Everybody relax." She said the word game, but nobody in that room, including her, was confused about what had actually happened. It was written on her face. This wasn't a dare that had gotten out of hand. This was a debt she'd carried for 2 years and had just publicly collected. Grace Ellery didn't laugh. She set her drink down on the nearest surface with a small, deliberate sound and stood very still. A handful of people near her went quiet too, but only quiet. None of them said a word. Nathan didn't raise his voice, and he didn't raise his hand. He took a napkin from the table beside him and wiped his face and neck, unhurried. While he did it, he looked around the room. He looked at Derek Sloan, still laughing. He looked at the people holding phones. He looked at the 2 vice presidents by the window who'd worked with him for 6 years and were now laughing into their sleeves. He looked at the man from legal who'd come to his office in March asking for help. Help Nathan had given him. He went around the room and took in each face in turn, and he didn't seem angry, which was the part several of them would remember later, when it mattered a great deal to remember it correctly. He wasn't planning anything. He was simply recording it. Then he looked at Elena, wiped the last of the champagne from his jaw, and asked her, quite evenly, whether she was sure she wanted everyone to remember the night this way. The question didn't sound like a threat. That was the problem with it, a threat would have given her something to push against. Instead it just hung in the air, like a note left on her desk, and for a moment Elena's smile lost a little of its shape before she found it again. "I'm sure," she said. Grace reached him first, near the elevator bank, where the music was only a vibration through the wall. She told him to go home. She told him she'd put it in writing to the board herself, that she'd witnessed it, that there were at least 4 recordings of it, and that under any reading of the company's own conduct policy, this was actionable before it was anything else. Nathan thanked her. Then he told her he wasn't filing anything, and he wasn't leaving the party. Grace studied him with the expression of a woman who'd spent 19 years learning to tell the difference between pride and calculation. "This isn't a small thing," she said. "If you let it pass tonight, it becomes the baseline. Whatever she does next, she'll measure it against this and decide it's reasonable." "I know," Nathan said. "And you're going to let her?" "I'm going to let her show me." Grace told him she wasn't comfortable sitting on it. He asked her to hold the report for 30 days. She agreed to that much and no further, on one condition, stated precisely. If there was a second incident of any kind, she would file immediately, without consulting him first. Nathan accepted without argument. Some part of her had already understood that the person in the most danger that night wasn't the man with champagne in his collar. Elena came looking for him 20 minutes later. She found him back near the windows, jacket off and folded over his arm, shirt still damp across one shoulder, mid-conversation with 2 people from the logistics division who hadn't laughed and now couldn't decide where to look. She came close enough that no one else could hear. She told him quietly that the period in which he'd been able to make her uncomfortable was over. She told him she was chief executive now and he was a subordinate, and that this wasn't an insult. It was simply the structure. Then she told him that if he didn't care for how she intended to run the company, resignation was available to him at any hour of any day, and she'd sign the paperwork personally. Nathan listened without interrupting. Up close, she could see his eyes weren't wet and his jaw wasn't tight, and that unsettled her more than anger would have. What she couldn't see was the calculation he was actually running. He had 2 choices in front of him, and he knew exactly what each one cost. He could respond now, escalate it, make it formal, make it personal. Within a week it would become a fight between 2 executives that the board would have to referee, and everyone in the building would file it under ambition. Elena would be careful for a year. She'd learn nothing, and she'd still be there. Or he could go silent, stay, and let a woman who believed there was no longer a single person in the building with the power to stop her find out exactly what she'd do with that belief. He'd watched what she did that night, when she thought the only thing at stake was a joke. He wanted to see what she'd do when she thought nobody was watching at all. "Understood," he said. Elena waited for more. There wasn't any. She walked away with the strong sense that she'd won, and the faint, unlocatable sense that she'd been agreed with rather than beaten. The recordings started moving before midnight. 2 of them went out that same night to people who hadn't even been at the party. Nathan was in the building the next morning at 7:20, 8 minutes earlier than usual. Fresh suit, same worn leather folder he always carried. He greeted the security desk by name, took the elevator to the 34th floor, and sat down to the logistics review he'd been scheduled to run that week. By 9, 3 separate people had found reasons to walk past his glass wall to see if he was actually there. He was. He didn't mention the party. He didn't mention Elena. When a director from the transport subsidiary asked awkwardly if he was all right, Nathan said he was fine and asked her about a pending yard contract. After a moment, she answered, and the moment passed. By the end of that first day, an interpretation had settled across 2 floors like weather. He'd taken it. He'd absorbed a public humiliation from the new chief executive and come back the next morning as though nothing had happened, which meant one of 2 things, and the building chose the easier one. It meant Nathan Voss knew where he stood now. Elena believed it more completely than anyone. She'd spent 2 years assembling a picture of a rival, and she'd been prepared for him to fight, complain, go to the board, resign in a way designed to embarrass her. What she hadn't prepared for was compliance, and compliance was the one response she had no way to read. So she read it the way that flattered her. She decided silence was surrender. That was her first mistake, and it wasn't the expensive one. The expensive one came from what the first mistake let her believe next. That the building now contained no door she couldn't open, no person she couldn't move, and no consequence that could reach her. She began running the company on that assumption within the week. The restructuring memo went out on day 9. 3 pages long, it read to anyone outside the building like an ordinary consolidation of reporting lines. Inside the building, it read like a list. 4 division heads were shifted sideways into roles with titles that sounded lateral and weren't. 2 regional directors were given early retirement packages generous enough to discourage them from talking about why. The common thread wasn't performance. 2 of the 4 had the strongest numbers in their segments. The common thread was that all of them had, at some point in the past 2 years, told Elena Marsh no in a room with other people in it. Derek Sloan kept corporate operations and picked up the entire transport portfolio in the same memo, roughly doubling his territory. He accepted it with a public modesty that fooled no one and didn't need to. He'd chosen a side in a room full of people holding phones, and he was being paid in exactly the currency he'd expected. Nathan's name appeared nowhere in the memo. His title didn't change. His compensation didn't change. What changed was the calendar. The Monday strategy session he'd run for 6 years moved to a time he wasn't invited to. The subsidiary review committee dropped him from its distribution list. Within 3 weeks he'd gone from a man whose signature appeared on every major transaction to a man who learned about transactions from the internal announcement feed like everyone else. The video kept circulating through that same stretch, 19 seconds, shot from behind and slightly to the left, catching everything, including the applause. It moved through the company the way those things do, forward once as a joke, then 20 times over as proof the joke was safe to make. Nathan became a subject, not openly, never to his face, but in the small, permanent way that follows a person down a hallway. Conversations adjusted themselves half a second before he entered a room. A junior analyst on the 31st floor made a champagne joke in a group chat with 40 people and wasn't disciplined for it, and everyone noticed that too. The people who'd respected him did the math and arrived at the same answer: standing near Nathan Voss was now expensive. The transport director who'd asked if he was all right stopped stopping by. The man from legal he'd helped in March sent one apology email about nothing in particular, then nothing else. 6 years of goodwill evaporated in under a month, and it didn't require anyone to be cruel. It only required everyone to be careful. Elena didn't let the moment go to waste. In a leadership briefing at the end of that month, she referred to the party without naming it, in the middle of a passage about accountability, and said that at Ironbridge, people needed to understand where they stood. She said it lightly. Several people laughed. She let the laugh run its course before moving to the next slide, and that was the entire point of the exercise. Nathan kept working. He arrived at 7:20. He ran what he was still allowed to run. He wrote the reports he was still required to write, exactly as well as he'd written them a year earlier, which a small number of people noticed and said nothing about. He also began to see the shape of what she was doing to the company, and it was worse than what she was doing to him. Internally, the plan was called Redline. Elena intended to sell Cascadia Freight Systems, a logistics subsidiary in the interior region that had lost money in 6 of the last 8 quarters and looked, on any single page of financials, like an obvious amputation. Selling it would strip a persistent loss off the consolidated statement and put roughly $400 million on the balance sheet in the same period. Her first full year as chief executive would open with a clean number and a decisive story. Nathan had spent 2 weeks inside Cascadia's operations 18 months earlier, and he knew what was buried there. The losses were real, and almost entirely a legacy fleet problem. What didn't appear anywhere on the income statement was a routing and load optimization system Cascadia's engineering group had spent 4 years quietly building, along with the patents underneath it worth more than the terminal network it ran on. 2 of the 3 largest freight brokerages in the country had approached Cascadia about licensing it in the past year and been told it wasn't for sale. The buyer now offering to acquire Cascadia was a holding company whose ownership, 3 layers down, resolved into one of those same brokerages. They weren't buying a failing carrier. They were buying what the failing carrier was standing on top of at a price that reflected only the fleet. He wrote it up. 22 pages, with the patent filings, the licensing approaches, the ownership trace, and a 5-year projection under 2 scenarios. It was the most careful document he'd produced in years, and he wrote it knowing exactly who would read it, and how she'd feel while reading it. Elena didn't get past page 4. She saw the recommendation. She saw the name at the bottom and understood it, in her framework, as a man who'd been publicly shown his place and chosen to stand somewhere else anyway. She sent it back through her assistant with a single line on the cover sheet: strategy would be consulted when strategy was required. The quarterly leadership meeting was held in the large conference room on the 38th floor, with divisional heads and 4 board members present. The last scheduled forum where the Cascadia decision could be formally questioned before the deal moved to signing. Nathan had 11 minutes on the agenda, at the end, for an item listed as strategic review. Nobody expected anything from it. He used 9 minutes. He put up the patent filings first, then the 2 licensing approaches with dates, then the ownership trace with the intermediate entities named. Then he put up a range for what the terminal network and routing system would be worth to the acquirer within 4 to 6 years, against the $400 million Ironbridge was about to receive for all of it. The low end of the range was $1.8 billion. The room changed. It wasn't dramatic, it was the sound of a dozen senior people simultaneously deciding to look at the screen instead of at the chief executive. One of the directors asked Nathan a technical question about the patent expiry schedule, and technical questions from directors were how a board signaled it had started taking something seriously. Grace Ellery asked whether the licensing approaches had been disclosed in the transaction materials. Nathan said they hadn't. She wrote something down. Elena watched 3 of her own directors lean forward, and what she felt wasn't doubt about the transaction. What she felt was the chair moving under her. 11 years, and it had been hers for less than 2 months, and the same man was doing the same thing he'd always done, being more right than her in front of people who mattered. She didn't attack the analysis. She couldn't, and some part of her knew she couldn't, which is why she went where she went. She thanked Nathan for what she called his enthusiasm. She said she was going to be direct with the room, because the room deserved directness. Then she brought up the party. She said some people had found the evening amusing and some hadn't, but that she'd assumed a senior executive would understand what it communicated. She said she was beginning to think the message hadn't landed, that Nathan still hadn't quite worked out who ran the company. A few people laughed, not many. Derek laughed, and 2 others laughed because Derek did, and the sound was thinner than it had been on the top floor, and everyone in the room heard how thin it was. Elena announced that the strategy office was being removed from the Cascadia transaction entirely, and that Derek Sloan would carry it through to close with full authority. She said it in the tone of an administrative note. Nathan didn't sit down, and he didn't raise his voice. He asked her one question. If her decision cost Ironbridge billions in long-term value, was she prepared to answer for it to the person who actually owned the company? Elena laughed. It came easily, because to her the question wasn't even clever. Ownership at Ironbridge was institutional, diffuse index funds, pension vehicles, and a founding family that had spent 2 decades gradually stepping back. There was no person. There was a cap table. If whoever that is has a problem, she said, tell him to come see me. Nathan closed his folder and said one word, fine. He said it the way a man closes an account, not the way a man surrenders one. Grace Ellery looked up at him from the far end of the table, and for the first time since the night of the party, she looked genuinely alarmed, though not for him. That evening, she filed the report she'd agreed to hold. She copied 3 directors and the general counsel, and didn't tell Nathan she'd done it. From that afternoon on, the 2 of them were no longer fighting the same fight. Elena was fighting for her position. Nathan had stopped fighting altogether and had begun quietly documenting. She decided within the week that Nathan had to be gone before the next full board meeting. The Cascadia signing was scheduled for the 28th of the following month. If he was still an officer of the company when the directors convened, he'd have standing to force the item onto the agenda, and she'd already seen the room lean forward once. She started with Human Resources, a complete, discreet review of his file, going back to his first day. It came back almost sterile. No complaints in either direction. No expense irregularities across years of travel through a dozen countries. Every performance review in the top band, several signed by directors rather than his nominal supervisor. The personal section was thin to the point of strangeness. Emergency contact listed as a law office rather than a person, no prior employer references, no education verification on file because someone above HR had waived it before he started. Elena read the signature line on 2 of the reviews twice. The surname sat there in front of her, and she looked directly at it and decided it meant nothing, because the alternative was that she'd spent 2 years at war with someone whose position she'd fundamentally misunderstood, and that wasn't a thought she was willing to finish. A man with that name and that connection would have been running a division by 30. She filed the thinness under privacy, privacy under arrogance, and moved on. A perfect file should have made her cautious. Instead, it made her impatient. So she changed instruments. If there was no misconduct in the record, she'd create one. She opened a formal internal matter alleging that Nathan had deliberately undermined an approved strategic decision of the chief executive, solicited directors outside the governance process, and created factional division within leadership. The language was careful, drafted to sound like governance rather than revenge, and on paper it very nearly did. Derek Sloan provided a written statement confirming that Nathan had circulated unauthorized analysis in an attempt to reverse a decision already made. It was technically accurate and completely dishonest. He signed it 12 days after receiving the transport portfolio, in under 4 minutes, because by then his own position was welded to hers and he understood the physics of it perfectly. 3 others signed statements too. All 3 had been in the room on the top floor, and all 3 had laughed. Grace Ellery asked for a meeting and got 20 minutes. She told Elena plainly that she was building a case against a man whose only documented offense was being right in writing, that 4 directors had now read his Cascadia analysis, and that if the deal closed and the analysis turned out correct, every document Elena was currently generating would be read back to her in a room she didn't control. She also said something Elena didn't answer, that in her time on the board, she'd never once seen anyone move against Nathan Voss, and had always assumed there was a reason for it. Elena thanked her for the perspective and said the matter was already in process. She'd reached the stage that power reaches in certain people, where the building itself starts to feel like an extension of the body. Every door opened. Every request was granted. Every silence was read as agreement. She'd begun mistaking compliance for consensus, the most expensive error available to an executive, and there was no one left in her orbit willing to charge her for it. Nathan took a call one Tuesday evening, alone in his office, lights off, the city going on beneath him. He didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. The voice on the other end asked one question: was he certain he wanted to let this go as far as it was going? Nathan answered that he wanted to see what they'd do when they believed nobody was watching. The line was quiet for a few seconds. Then the man said he'd be there when it was time, and that Nathan should understand there'd be no partial version of this. Once it started, it would go all the way through, and a number of people wouldn't survive it. Nathan said he understood. Neither of them said the other's name. The special session was called for 4 o'clock on a Thursday, on the top floor, in the room with the north-facing windows. Same room. Nobody remarked on it, and everybody registered it. Elena opened without preamble. She announced that Nathan Voss was suspended, effective immediately, pending the conclusion of an internal investigation into insubordination and conduct damaging to the interests of the company. She said that phrase, conduct damaging to the interests of the company, twice, because it was the phrase her counsel had approved. She asked for his badge. Derek set a cardboard box on the table in front of Nathan and told him he could collect his personal items under supervision. A few people laughed, not the whole room this time, only 4 or 5, and Nathan noted, without particular emotion, that they were the same faces. The man from legal. 2 of the vice presidents from the windows. Derek, of course, who'd now laughed at him twice in the same room and built his entire year on it. Elena came around the end of the table and stopped in front of him, close enough to be personal, loud enough not to be private. "This time it isn't a joke, Nathan," she said. Nathan unclipped his badge from his jacket and set it on the table between them. He didn't slide it toward her, he just set it down and left it there. By any reading available in that room, it was finished. He'd lost his title, his access, his standing, and the last of the people who'd once worked beside him. He'd spent 6 weeks being reduced in public, and this was the floor. At the door, he turned back and looked at her. "You're right," he said. "This time it isn't a joke." He walked out at 4:20. The elevator doors closed on a room that had already started talking. 9 minutes later, every phone on that floor got the same automated notice from the chairman's office. Edmund Voss was en route to headquarters and had called an emergency session of the full board, all members, in person, within the hour. Elena read it twice. Then she smiled, because there was only one reason she could imagine for the chairman to come in on a Thursday evening, and she'd just spent 6 weeks building the file for it. Elena spent half an hour preparing. She had her assistant print the internal matter file in 5 copies, tabbed and bound, with Derek Sloan's statement and the 3 supporting statements up front and the suspension memo on top. She reviewed her opening twice in her head. A chairman who comes in on a Thursday evening wants a problem removed, and she intended to be the one who'd already removed it. The directors filed in from wherever they'd been, some had clearly left dinner mid-course. Grace Ellery arrived early, took a seat halfway down the table, and didn't speak to anyone, which several people noticed. Edmund Voss entered 10 minutes past 5, the company's general counsel, Walter Finch, at his left, 2 additional directors behind him. He was 73, hadn't held an operating role in 12 years, and the room still stood. He didn't sit. He walked the length of the table, stopped near its head, and looked down at one particular chair, empty. "Where is Nathan?" he asked, though he'd known the answer before his car reached the building, and asked anyway, so it would be spoken aloud, in front of everyone, by the person who'd made it true. Elena answered with the confidence she'd prepared. She said she'd suspended him that afternoon, pending an internal investigation, and that the file was in front of every director, and that she was prepared to walk the board through the grounds. Edmund didn't look at the file. He looked at the empty chair a moment longer, then at the window, then back at her. "Who approved that decision?" he asked. "I did," Elena said. "I'm the chief executive." Edmund let that sit in the room. He looked slowly around the table, at Derek Sloan, at the 2 vice presidents from the windows, at the man from legal, at every face that had signed something or laughed at something in the past 6 weeks. It was the same sweep Nathan had made across the same room on the night of the party, and 1 or 2 people were far enough along in understanding to recognize it. Then he told them something almost no one in the operating structure of Ironbridge Holdings knew. Nathan Voss was his son, his only son. He joined the company at 26 on one condition, that no one below the board would be told. Edmund had kept that condition every year since. The room didn't react at first, because information of that size doesn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the deference from 2 directors nobody could source, the performance review signed above his level, the personnel file with no references and a law office listed as emergency contact, the reason a man who'd fixed half the subsidiaries on the eastern seaboard had never once mentioned his family. Elena's face didn't move. Underneath it, 6 weeks of her own decisions were being rapidly reread in a new light, and every one of them was worse than it had been 10 seconds earlier. Edmund wasn't finished. He told the board his succession planning had been complete for some time, and that Walter Finch could confirm the instruments. The Voss family's controlling block, together with its voting rights, would transfer to Nathan on Edmund's departure from the chairmanship. It wasn't a proposal, and it wasn't subject to a vote. It had been documented years earlier and reviewed twice since. Walter Finch confirmed from the end of the table that the structures were in place and that he'd personally reviewed them that spring. The arithmetic completed itself in every head in the room at roughly the same moment. The man Elena Marsh had poured champagne over in front of dozens of people, then isolated, then stripped from his own project, then mocked in a leadership meeting, then suspended in this same room with a cardboard box on the table in front of him, was the man who would control a company worth just under $20 billion. He'd never been competing for her chair, not once, in 2 years. She'd built the entire war inside her own head, against someone who'd never wanted the thing she was defending, because he had something structurally larger, and had chosen, for reasons now visible to everyone, to say nothing about it. Derek Sloan had lost all the color in his face and was staring at a point on the table roughly a foot in front of his own hands. Nathan was asked to return. He came up from the lobby, where he'd been sitting for the better part of an hour, without the badge, left on the table, never picked back up. Nobody laughed. He took the empty chair, set the same worn leather folder in front of him, and didn't open it right away. Elena spoke first, making the only move she had left, reframing the beginning. She said the evening in question had been a game, played among consenting adults after a long day, that champagne had been involved in, judgment had been imperfect on all sides, and that she was prepared to apologize for a moment of poor taste. She was still, even then, trying to make the whole thing about a glass of wine, because a glass of wine was survivable. Nathan told her he wasn't there because of the champagne. He opened the folder. He said a person's conduct at a party after 11 o'clock wasn't a governance matter, what happened afterward was. Then he walked the board through it in order, without raising his voice once. He laid out the restructuring memo, and the 4 division heads moved for reasons that never appeared in their performance records, noting that 2 of the 4 had led their segments. He laid out the transport portfolio going to Derek Sloan, and the statement Derek signed 12 days after receiving it. He laid out the Cascadia analysis again, this time including the section not shown at the quarterly meeting. Internal correspondence in which 2 directors had asked for a second opinion on the deal and been told, in writing, that the strategic review had already been completed. It hadn't been completed. It had been returned unread, with a note that strategy would be consulted when strategy was required. He laid out the licensing approaches never disclosed in the counterparty file, the ownership trace, and the signing date 18 days out, on which the company would have handed over a terminal network and routing system worth at least $1.8 billion for $400 million. He laid out the HR request and the fact that it had produced nothing, and the fact that an internal matter had been opened 11 days after it produced nothing. Then he put the 4 signed statements on the table, including Derek Sloan's, and beside them a list of everyone present on the top floor the night of the party. Every one of the 4 names appeared on both lists. He didn't editorialize. He let the 2 columns sit side by side and let the directors read across. Last, he said there were 19 seconds of video, shot on 4 different phones, that had circulated to somewhere over 200 employees, and that the clip mattered not as an insult, but because it was the moment the company's leadership learned what was permitted. Everything that followed had been a reasonable inference from it. He told the board plainly that the party hadn't cost Elena Marsh her position. What cost her the position was what she did once she believed there was no longer anyone above her. Grace Ellery moved for an emergency vote and noted for the record that she'd filed a written report on the incident weeks earlier. Edmund Voss, as chairman, put the motion. Walter Finch recorded it. Elena Marsh was suspended from the office of chief executive, pending a full governance investigation, with the Cascadia transaction frozen immediately and referred to outside counsel for review. The vote wasn't close. Derek Sloan was placed under separate investigation for the decisions he'd executed on her behalf and the statement he'd signed, and removed from the transport portfolio. In the same motion, he asked to be allowed to explain, and was told he'd have that opportunity in writing, to the investigators. Elena didn't argue. She'd been trying to construct a sentence for several minutes and hadn't found one that survived contact with the room. When she finally looked at Nathan, what she said was that he could have told her, at any point, in 2 years. Nathan answered that he could have. He said he'd wanted to know how she'd treat someone she believed couldn't fight back, and that she'd answered the question completely, without ever once being forced to. That was the end of the exchange, and the last conversation the 2 of them ever had inside that building. Afterward, in the hallway and over the following 2 days, the apologies began. The man from legal came first, then one of the vice presidents from the windows, then a steady procession of people who'd laughed on the top floor and had spent 6 weeks carefully not standing too close to him. Nathan didn't ask for any of them to be fired. He could have, the board would have signed off on almost anything he requested that particular week, and at least a dozen people's behavior would have supported it. What he told Grace, when she asked directly what he intended to do about them, was that he didn't need people who were afraid of him. He needed people capable of standing up when something wrong was happening in front of them. He asked Grace Ellery to lead the governance restructuring group, and told her why. On the night of the party, when the whole room was laughing, she'd set her glass down and stayed silent, one of the very few who hadn't joined in. That was the only credential he cared about. Grace accepted, and told him she'd also gone to Elena privately and warned her, and failed, and that he should know that before handing her anything. Nathan said that was the second reason he was asking. The investigation ran 4 months. Elena Marsh never returned to the building. Her departure was announced in a 2-paragraph release that used the word transition, which fooled no one who'd been in the room and wasn't meant to. The Cascadia deal was killed. Outside counsel confirmed the ownership trace and found that the undisclosed licensing approaches would have exposed the company to a shareholder claim if the sale had closed. The routing system stayed inside Ironbridge. 2 years later, the first external licensing agreement built on it was signed at terms that made Nathan's low estimate look conservative, though by then, very few people connected the two events. Derek Sloan left in the second month, before the investigation reached its findings, the way people leave when they've read the direction of the current correctly. Edmund Voss announced his retirement that autumn. There was a press release, a photograph, a line about 4 decades of service. He didn't give a speech to leadership, because he'd already said the only thing he'd come to say, on the top floor, on a Thursday evening, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Nathan Voss took control of Ironbridge Holdings as successor to the family block that same quarter. There was no party. That was noticed immediately, and understood almost as fast. Instead, he called the entire leadership team to the same room with the north-facing windows and stood at the end of it, where Elena had once stood with a glass in her hand. He gave them 3 governance principles, without preamble. No title in the company would ever sit higher than the responsibility attached to it. No employee would ever be humiliated for the entertainment of a room. And any person, at any level, had a standing right to object to a decision in writing, protected from retaliation, if they held evidence it would harm the company. The third was written into the conduct policy within the week, with a reporting line that ran to Grace Ellery's committee rather than through the executive office. Which was the entire point of it. The room was completely silent while he spoke. Same room, same view, a significant number of the same faces. Some had laughed the night of the party. Some had held up phones. Several had signed nothing, said nothing, done nothing, and were discovering that this was its own category and that he knew exactly which category each of them belonged to. He never mentioned the champagne. Not that day, not ever again, in that room or any other. Over the following years, the people who'd been there stopped waiting for him to. He closed with one line, then left the room. How a person treats someone they believe cannot fight back tells you who they actually are. Power doesn't build character. It only removes the reasons a person had for hiding the character they already had. Elena Marsh didn't become cruel the night she was promoted. She simply stopped needing to pretend otherwise, and everything that followed was already inside her, waiting for permission. Don't measure a person's worth by their title, their appearance, or the position they happen to occupy today. The one being laughed at tonight may be the one making the decisions tomorrow, and there's rarely any warning. But that isn't the real lesson, and it would be a poor one to take away. If you're kind only because the quiet person in the corner might turn out to be powerful, you haven't learned anything, you've only gotten better at calculating. Treat people decently, not because of what they might one day be able to do to you, but because respect should never have depended on anyone's position in the first place.